All right, let's kick it off. Thank you, everyone, for coming to today's seminar by Professor Jin Liu from University of Copenhagen. I also thank people online. Sorry, I can't see you. I can't see me, but hopefully you can hear me. My name's Haiqing Yu. I'm a professor of media communication at RMIT University. I'm also a chief investigator at the ADM+S Center. Professor Jin Liu is award-winning author, and he's also associate professor in the Center for Tracking and Society, University of Copenhagen. His research areas cover political communication, political sociology, ICTs, and comparative computational social science. He's leading a kind of 4-year comparative study on political movements in China, EU, and US, and today's talk will be based on his previous research and the current research is conducting at the moment. The topic is clock, cloud, and everyday politics in understanding activism. So, Jin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Haiqing Yu, for inviting me and also the Center ADM+S to host this talk. So, as you can see, my topic is about clocks, clouds, and everyday politics in understanding digital activism. I would like to start the talk by very briefly talk about some of my research interests, so we get more place to discuss possible collaboration and also further research interests. So as Professor Yu already mentioned, I think my main research focus is about political sociology. So that's like a sociological study of politics and political phenomenon, also datafication, comparative social sciences. So basically, I try to, you could say, cluster some of my work, mostly, you could say, added special issues in journals into like 2 general topics. So one is about comparative social sciences. And for example, we do a lot of research about how we could compare digital media research. So one of the very various issue that we study is that how to advance this comparative study when we talk about digital media. So we have a special issue in like 4 years ago, 2020, where we actually invite, for example, Daniel Harling and Paolo Mancini, who are 2 leading scholars in the work comparing media studies. We try to advance their study about like how we could do comparative studies in the case of digital media. And then this year, we also have a special issue in the Journal of Information Technology and Politics, which we specifically would like to advance the discussion on studied social media and political contention. So this is one of the main research focus together with my research interests about comparative study of digital activism and political contention in Europe, China, and the United States. So that's one of the main research interests. And the other research interest is about datafication. Again, it also has a kind of comparative perspective, but it also speaks to both theoretical and methodological issues in this case. For example, 2 years ago, we have a special issues in the journal called Big Data Society, where we try to advance the concept called social data governance. We want to specifically address, you could say, a contextual understanding of both the governing foundation and the effect of datavism, datafication in different society. And then I also have my own contribution in that special issue to try to explicate, you could say, the keyword social data governance, that is to account for, you could say, the social dynamics that underpin and contextualize the design, operationalization, promotion of quantified governance mechanisms, which I recognize that's actually a common general things in this ADSM. So a lot of overlapping interest in this case, where actually I'm working with another colleagues in Vienna. Actually, we are currently proposing another special issue in the Big Data Society talking about generative AI and digital authoritarianism. So I can talk more in the later section. So that's one of the things. And then what you could also see is I actually have 2 ongoing special issue. One is in the Journal of Big Data, where that's mostly about a methodological issue. We want to talk about how we could better understand this big data in human behavior research, how we could use computational methods or mixed methods issues to actually better account for, you could say, contextual elements that we want to investigate in different scenarios. You could say big data research has been usually criticized because they actually miss these very relevant contextual elements in this case. So this is the ongoing issue. Actually, I believe it will come out earlier next year. There's another special issue in the critical sociology, which we actually, the tentative topic title here is Reimagine Quantification, Scoring, Credibility in and Beyond System. So that basically try to explore again, I think that's the common thing in ADM+S here, a context, you could say, a quantification regarding scoring and credibility. That actually exists for very long and many forms in this case, but it also become increasingly, you could say, prominent issue in contemporary societies. So in this case, we try to understand, for example, different governance systems that rate citizens and also automatic contract tracing technologies in this case. And I also realized that actually one of the contributors, Frank Plasbrook, so from the Cornell Law, actually is associated with the ADM+S Center here. So as I say, there's already actually existing connections between my research and the center here. So that's basically what my most research actually of spatial issues has been devoted to. So now turn to some interesting case. So as I say, one of my main research interests is about political contention in the digital age. So I have published one of my first books in the Oxford University Press 4 years ago called Shifting Dynamic of Contention in Digital Age. So that's basically try to look at, because there are various kind of argument and controversies about whether you could say the digital media revolutionized political activism. So basically the book tried to look at that, not just based on China. In the case I studied the mobile communication in China, but also carry out a kind of comparative perspective, try to understand this dynamic, you could say, in the digital media, compare, for example, Egypt, China, and the United States. And I have an ongoing project. So this talk is largely based on the ongoing project here, funded by the Independent Research from Denmark. So that's the largest national level funding in Denmark. It's called To Use or Not to Use, a Relational Approach to Information Communication Technologies as Repertoire of Contention. That's from Charles Tilly. If you don't know that, I'm going to elaborate that later. In this project, basically try to compare, you could say, political contentions in, I'm trying to do two things, actually. One is a historical overview about digital activism, or the political activism with and without digital technologies. So we have just finished the collection of database, 30 years database, because there's a lot of discussion, for example, about, okay, the digital technology have already revolutionized political contention. But how could we know that from a historical perspective? So basically what I'm doing is that actually we take a like 30-year trajectory from 1990s to 2020. We want to investigate, for example, the trend of using digital technology in political movement. So that's like a big data computational analysis. It's a very classic sociological analysis about newspaper coverage on political contention with and without digital technology. So that's the, you could say, quantitative part of the project. And then we also have a qualitative part of the project. That's a more comparative, you could say, perspective of the project, where we are going to, or I'm going to actually select political movement, political contentions in individual cases, and then do a comparative study, probably like the most similar case or most different case, comparative case study, in order to understand the use or not to use digital technology. And I think it's interesting, especially in this case, not just to understand how people use technology, but I actually try to argue, but also in my later presentation, that actually sometimes it's even more relevant to think about why people don't choose certain technology or certain specific use of technology to be used in this case. So that is actually my second book that I'm currently working on. Hopefully that will be a exciting book, as I say. So what I would like to do is I always want to make the presentation a bit interactive instead of me just talking about in this like 45 minutes. So I think what I would like to do is that basically if we think about political activism, you could say political activism through digital media or digital technology has become, you could say, a well-established research topic over the last 3 decades. So we have seen plenty of examples all around the world where people, they are leveraging digital technology like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, X, or TikTok to push for social and political change. And then you could say it appears to be, you could say, a similar phenomenon across the world that digital activism and resistance, they are increasingly enabled, mediated, and facilitated by digital technology. But I want to actually, I have identified kind of intriguing issues. So what I try to do in this case is basically ask you to think like a digital activism. So try to imagine yourself if you are an activist or if you were an activist for various reasons, then I would like to ask you which digital technology or applications would you adopt for activism and resistance. So in this case, I would like, you can see we have a mentee in this case, and there's also a QR code. So I would very much actually like you to think about, like the title says, thinking like activism, to try to imagine yourself, your thoughts on this question. What would be your choice in this case? I suggest that we can just take like 2 to 3 minutes, and then we can take a look at the response in this case. Many of you have already submitted the answer. Just remind me. I try to see if the mentee is still working. In this case, I haven't checked that before the talk. I have to say that.
Just one tech?
Yeah, just one tech, or maybe more than one. Yeah, the most prominent technology is that.
So we can't enter a text-based. So it's just a yes or no.
Ah, there's a.
Is there just one?
Okay. There's no. There's just yes or no. There's just yes or no. There's no place to have your.
To present it as a change.
Can we deconstruct the question?
Okay. Yeah. Okay, that's probably. I'm sorry about the technical problem here. Yeah. So. But maybe I think we can open the floor and then collect some of your inputs.
Yes, he said presenter hasn't changed the slides yet.
Yes,
okay.
that's what I've got.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah. But I think the basic idea actually is try to see, for example, how many of you choose the platforms like Facebook or X or Instagram or TikTok. Besides those platforms, are there any other kind of platform that you could investigate?
I would go for what people call blogging these days, Substack.
Yeah.
I'll go for Substack.
Why?
In my particular case, because I like writing, so I would be quite an academic type of activist. I would write stuff.
Okay.
Via Substack.
Thanks.
I think as you gestured towards in your earlier slides, it's context specific.
Yeah.
And it's strategic. So, for instance, I'm involved in the Palestinian movement here at RMIT, and that group it's been possible not to sociologically analyze what they do.
Yeah.
And they're constantly shifting between the use of different apps, depending on whether they want a megaphone of advertising to the world, whether they just want to communicate via WhatsApp within the group.
Yes.
And with WhatsApp, we've got multiple channels for doing different things. So it's very strategic and context specific.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the answer very much. I think that's not just particular platform or restricted to particular platform, but also the diversity of platform, and maybe diverse use of the platform. I think that's excellent. Other kind of guess.
And just to follow up on that point, it also depends on, I guess, the people that you're trying to organize.
Yeah, that's a key
Because
thing.
you have to meet people where they're at. So, for example, if the people you're trying to organize all use Facebook, maybe with all of the problems of Facebook aside, maybe that's the platform you need to use because that's where the people are.
Yes.
Yeah, on that point, yes, it depends on what people you talk, what kind of people you talk to.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's for general audience globally, I'll use Twitter. But if I'm talking to the Chinese speaking people in Australia, I will use Xiaohongshu, WeChat.
Yes.
Yeah, so it just depends what kind of issue it is.
Yeah.
And also, I think it's the nature of the activity that you want to organize. Some may work at some platforms. For example, most recently on Weibo, there's like a sexual harassment of professor of their students, and that was initially went viral on Weibo, and they followed up by all other platforms, mostly Chinese platforms, because it's a Chinese very specific incident. So I think the nature of the incidents also matter, like where you want to reach the maximum impact,
Yes.
and whether the impact can be reached just through that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks very much. I think that's excellent, despite the fact that actually the slide, unfortunately, I have to apologize again that did not work. But I think the main idea in this case, as we just talked about, is very diverse in this case. When we are thinking about activism, thinking about different kinds of technologies that we could use in different cases, we have to think about, as all of you talk about, I think one of the key things that I could imagine, I could try to summarize in this case is, you could say, the agency in this case is the people. We have to think about our living circumstances. We have to think about our expertise. We have to think about the audience that we are talking about. We have to think about the nature of the event in this case. So we know that digital activism in this case, first and foremost, that's something I would like to remind you. So this is, I believe, is, you could say, a fundamental aspect of digital activism and resistance. So in this case is that, but I also try to argue that what we are just talking about is, you could say, an aspect that has been largely overlooked in current scholarship. So that is people's choice and selection in this case about the digital activism. We know that digital activism is about people. It's first and foremost about people. It's about individual, or it's about groups leveraging digital technologies to bring about political, social, economic, environment change in this case. So in this sense, you could say which aspect of people's behaviors demonstrate that they are exercising their agency, like what you just talked about. Maybe think about nature of the event, maybe think about deliberation, about the visibility of the activism. So you could say the capacity of an actor in digital activism and resistance. And then that also pushes us to a next question that I'm going to ask. That's where can we observe and thereby study such kind of agency, or you could say the capacity of an actor during these people's encountered with digital technology in this case. And then that's also why I think it's one of the many ways of answering this question is to think like activism in this case. So among many capacities we would identify during our encounter with digital technology, the fundamental aspect agency that we might consider, just like what we were doing here is the choice and selection made prior, you could say, to the use of technology. I think this is quite relevant. And let me see. I could move to, okay. So I would like to show you more kind of real cases in this case. So that is something that I argue that is something very interesting. Largely, you could say, if you look at individual cases, you will probably not to identify this kind of issue. But I'm going to show you, for example, from this, how to say, the top right-hand side here. So what you can see in this side is an image from political activism called For Fair Elections. How many of you know that? For Fair Election, that is a demonstration against electoral fraud in Russia 2011 State Duma election, and over 100,000 people involved in this demonstration. And I'm also would like to know any of you familiar with Russia social media in this room, or online in this case. And then I think if you're not familiar, then probably it's very difficult. But what you can see is that actually the VK called vKontakte, and also the next one is called Odonoklasnisi. So they are the two top social media sites in Russia back to 2011. In that case, what is interesting to me in this case is Russians, they did not choose the most, you could say, widely used social media in Russia. Instead, they choose Facebook, which ranked number 5, and also Twitter, which is even lower, to organize these for fair election protests. So I'm basically asking in this case, that's interesting because why didn't they choose, for example, vKontakte, which accounted for actually 5 times as many users as Facebook in this case? So that's something I think is interesting. And then move to your left-hand side. So that is indignado movements in Spain. That's another kind of movement extensively started, you could say, against this austerity politics in this case. And then the movement not only use Facebook and Twitter, but they also use an independent social media network called N1. I don't know any of you doing research about indignado movements? Yeah. So N1. So that is N1 also turned out to be with a very even higher, you could say, impact and more user than the website, the social network of indignado people in this case. And what you can see is that's the screenshot of N1 in this state. So the website appears somehow, you could say, shabby in this case, even by the standard of around 15 years ago. And the website had only 2,000 users before the campaign in this case. So in that case, we could ask a similar question. So that's why then the activism embraced Facebook, Twitter, and this specific website N1, which has such a small amount of user in this case. And the last case in the right-hand corner is the anti-extradition law amendment bill movement in Hong Kong between 2019 and 2020. And in that movement, actually people adopt the messaging app called Telegram and also local Reddit-like forums called Liandeng in Cantonese, in Mandarins in this case. And that is also an interesting case. In this case, because it's particularly interesting to see the local adopt Telegram and also Liandeng. And Telegram was previously not very popular in Hong Kong in this case. So instead of that very popular social media platform like YouTube or Instagram in Hong Kong or Facebook or WhatsApp, which were used earlier in the umbrella movement 5 years earlier, so they actually use a different platform or they shift the platform in this case. So I think that's very similar. That's a very interesting thing. So that's, I would say, similar to the question that I was asking you about the survey in this case. What interests me about these examples in the selection, variation, and change in adopting is this adopting digital technology for activism and resistance across different events, contexts, and society. So in other words, you could say, we could ask the question that is, what factors foster or you could say impel the choice and decision to adopt or reject specific digital technologies in activism and resistance in this case. So that's the beginning of the story. And then you could probably think about, okay, so how do this discussion related to the term clock and clouds in this case? I'm wondering, do these two words remind you a certain work when we say clouds and clocks in this case? Not really about clouds and clocks. So I think the terms clouds and clocks actually come from Karl Popper's article of clouds and clocks. So in this article, actually, Popper used these metaphors of clouds and clocks to represent, you could say, common sense notion of determinacy or indeterminacies in physical system. But the essential idea, you could say, is that clocks, they are predictable, right? When the clock functions, it's possible to dismantle it into smaller parts and diagnose the problem, replace the malfunctioning part, and put it back. So that's the idea of clocks. Clocks are predictable. But in contrast, you could say clouds, they are unpredictable. So if a cloud doesn't give enough rainwater, then we did not know how to fix that, or at least when Popper wrote the article in this case. And the other thing that we should remember is that clouds and clocks, they are not dichotomous in this case. So Popper in this article suggests us to imagine a kind of continuous stretching from this highly irregular, disorderly, and more or less unpredictable clouds to the left side, where we have these, that's on the left side, we have clouds. And then we have on the right side, that's most, you could say, most regular, orderly, highly predictable, that's clocks on the right side in this case. So I found the idea is very interesting. The other very interesting thing is that actually Karl Popper argued that, so how could we consider the human behavior? So human behavior is something intermediate between this perfect cloud and perfect clocks in this case. And then in this case, when we are going to study human society, human behavior, then we try to understand its purpose, deliberation, plans, decision, theory, intention, and values in this case. So as you can see here, so at the centers of this political reality, I'm quoting the Edmund and Gico's articles in 1977, they are talking about choices and decisions. That's the heart of the politics in this case. I could say contention politics. So this go back to my earlier discussion. Something is, you could say, overlooked when we look at digital activism in this case, or digital politics, that we actually underestimate or don't have sufficient study to understand people's choice and decisions in this case. So that is a very, so I say that it's precisely this choice and decision that are absent in the scholarship on digital technology and political activism or political contention. So I would like to remind you again, in the earlier discussion, earlier presentation, I emphasized this selections, variation, change, and essentially in this case, choice and decisions that people made. So that is the essential thing in understanding politics, and our case contention politics. But they remain somehow blind spots in the current scholarship. And how to say, then try to imagine the similar question that we could ask. Can we say that it is clock-like to adopt Facebook, X, Instagram, or is it cloud-like in this case? So that is I think the question that I would like to understand. And when talking about the general field of internet-based research, what we can see is a similar argument. For example, David Lazard and his co-author actually criticized that the basic population characteristic, and especially you could say this underlying mechanism that structure user behaviors or on digital platforms, these kind of issues remain relatively poorly understood in this case. So that's why I think they argue that, for example, they look at the Twitter research, and they argue the majority of research make inferences about accounts or tweets which you could say unable to make statements about human behaviors and decision making. And move to the scholarship on digital activism. And what we can see is that scholarship, you could say, preoccupies with, I argue that it's on the consequence rather than the cause of adopting and using digital technology, or going back to our earlier discussion, to say specific digital technology on digital activism or political activism. And I think actually without exploring the reason behind people's choice and decision, the adoption or utilization of specific technologies or application for activism is assumed to be very obvious, very natural, or you could say the only reasonable options without needing justification or debate in this case. So to reiterate, to emphasize again, you could say the choice and use of technology with their deliberations, reasonings, and diversities are ignored, it turned to be, you could say, a kind of clock-like political regularities in this case. So in a case we have political movement, then people automatically, taken for granted, use digital technology in this case. So that means the choice and decision to use some technologies, but not others, as we can see from the various cases that I have already presented, is taken for granted and also become a kind of self-evident issue in this case, as if there were no need to consider alternatives or question their appropriateness in this case. And that is not true in this case, I would say. So that is one of the things. And the other thing you could say is that the term technology itself, or concretely speaking, you could say terminology such as social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, they have been treated as essentialistic and also universal in this case. Again, you could say clock-like in this case, often in a very implicit way in existing scholarship. So when I say essentialistic and universal, I specifically refer to a lack of interest, you could say, in the meanings and interpretations of digital technologies. Or you could say, even you could argue, you could say it's a divergent meanings and interpretation of even the same technologies across time, situations, and contexts that could fundamentally underpin and shape its subsequent adoption and usage in political activism. But I know that there's also a lot of ethnographical work has been carried out in the RMIT University, thinking about anthropologists like Daniel Miller, and other kind of people that have already made very rich discoveries, which shows that internet is not, you could say, a monolithic media, right? It's a range of practices, software and hardware, technology, modes of representation, interaction. And we could also think about like a domestication theories, which is rooted in cultural study of media use and informed by science technology studies. They also try to look at how material objects acquire different social meanings as they were, or as they are incorporated in everyday experience. So this, you could say, going through this process, you could say the disinterest in the meanings and interpretation of technologies leads to the concern that what we can see Segerberg and Bennett raised in one of their articles. So I quote here, a risk that the defining political features of the technologies may become assumed rather than discovered in this case, unquote. So the consequence leads to failures to get a kind, you could say, a situated understanding of digital technology against different activist contexts. So that is the major issue. So to address these blind spots, I suggest that we should reframe our question. So as the title here proposed, so what is to be done with digital technology? So that I hope that resonate with you. Another classic work, the phrase "what is to be done" is from Lenin in this case, right? So it has been widely referenced in political discussion regarding the planning and organization for achieving social or political objectives. So while Lenin in this case argues that the working class or proletariat will not spontaneously become political and make a revolution. So I want to adapt the phrase here to emphasize that people or activists, they do not spontaneously use available digital technologies simply for activism and resistance. So it's not clock-like. Whether it's cloud-like, that's something interesting to see. So subsequently, it's crucial to understand why they take the positions they do with certain technologies or certain uses of digital technology, but not others in this case. So bear this in mind, I would say, I think it's also crucial to remember Charles Tilly's remark on contention performance, or the term repertoire of contention in this case. So the question here, you could say we should ask, I try to think about this kind of question in a kind of media saturated society, as research often describe it nowadays, is why do activists, why do plan makers use some specific digital technologies rather than others that could technologically be possible for activism? Or how do activism make choices and decisions that we talked about earlier? And what counts for the selection, variation, and change in the forms of digital activism and resistance wherever it occurs in this case? So bear this in. So to answer this question, so I believe it requires acknowledging the relevance of everyday needs or everyday politics. So that go back to the emphasis of this talk in the discussion of digital activism and resistance. So what is the meaning of everyday in this case? So the term everyday in this case draw from sociology of everyday life, which focuses on, you could say, analyzing people's experience in their natural everyday context. So that includes understanding the structure of relations created through daily encounters, in this case with digital technology, of course, and their associated meanings and feelings in this case. And then the politics, what does politics mean? So politics inspired by the slogan called "the personal is political." So that is used by student and feminist movement in Europe during the 1960s and 1970s. So that the term or the phrase emphasize how personal but also everyday matters escalated to political significance in digital activism and resistance. So to combine these two concepts, so I propose that everyday needs or everyday politics should be an integrated part of activism and resistance. So more importantly, you could say it serves as both the, you could say, benchmark and also the foundation for activism and resistance. And the benchmark means here that we use everyday needs as a reference or a standard against which we can observe and explain the specific ways in which people are sense-making, choosing, and adopting digital technologies for activism and resistance in this case. Okay, so how to unpack such kind of relevance of everyday needs in the discussion on digital activism and resistance? There is more fundamental issues that we are facing here. So that is what is technology. So I'm not going to expand the discussion at all, but one way to think about, to conceptualize technology is to think about Martin Heidegger. So Martin Heidegger actually addressed in his essay called "The Question Concerning Technology." So he talked about that the essence of technology is nothing technological in this case. So for Heidegger, you could say the Greek term technique, as you can see here, as the root of technology refers not only to the products and tools, but also to, you could say, the poetics and also aesthetics of the mind in this case. So techniques in this case should be interrogated and also reimagined in relation to the ontologies of community. That's the user, that's a citizen, that's a public, or that's activism in this case. And following this argument, you could say technologies, they are not essential in this case. And what technologies are for specific users and what these technologies can do depend on how they are related to a host of variables. That's context, situation, place, and of course, user in this case. So that's why, given these, as you can see here, I find the term social technologies, as used in several articles against by Segerberg and Bennett in Connective Action, to be more precise for capturing such kind of understanding of digital technology. But you could say actually Segerberg and Bennett, they did not provide an explanation of this term in their work. Therefore, I would like to elaborate that here, specifically in the scenario of everyday life and activism and resistance. So I think first is about the prefix social. So the prefix social in social technology denotes that technologies, they are inherently social objectives. Therefore, understanding their selection, variation, use, and non-use, as we observed in earlier cases of activism, is very crucial because they function as a social phenomenon. So that's a social, or you could say the sociality here. And then the social technology also imparts three critical meanings that I'm going to further elaborate that emphasize the need to consider technology not only during the time of crisis, that is a radical movement like activism, but also in their role in everyday life. So essentially, I argue that the term social technologies emphasize the need to build moment of activism and resistance through the lens of everyday social life in this case. Because the first thing is that the term social indicates sociality, as you can read from the slides here. So that means it's the establishment and maintenance of human interaction or human connections, both individually and in groups through digital technologies. So social technology, in the first sense, become naturalized as venues for social interaction and expressive collectivity. And that actually positions technology as a stage for social performance beyond its mere functional or instrumental use in activism, like mobilization or demobilization. Because the way people choose and interact with technologies in activism and resistance, such as the pattern of adoption, choices, and orientation around technology, reflect broader issue in this case. For example, some of you mentioned that if I would like to speak to the Chinese people, I would like to use the Chinese kind of platform instead of international platform, even though I have a broader audience in this case. So that means these socialities, collectivities, identities, everyday life to understand in this case. That perspective further opens up the discussion on what counts as activism and what does activism encompass in this case. So with that, we acknowledge that a range of activisms as political and a range of activities as political and activists in this case. And the second thing is societal context. So that means the technology bears the marks of societal context in which they are used or not used in this case, as well as how they are reinvented to support, you could say, activists' aspirations, values, and cultures. For example, in the case of activism and in Russia and Hong Kong, we observe the non-use of this, as I mentioned, this V-contactor, Facebook and WhatsApp, and also non-use often, you could say, it's not a straightforward as it might seem. It's in this case, you could say it's even more interesting to look at the case of non-use in this case. So that is one of the key issues that we could think about. And then you could say, especially in this case, we could imagine that it's not necessarily due to, when we talk about the non-use, it's not necessarily due to inaccessibility, but rather a deliberate choice against a certain context in this case. So we have an emerging study about digital disconnections, for example. So this highlight very complex societal context. It could be culture, it could be political, it could be economic arrangement that influence, but do not dictate the availability and appropriation of technology. And the third thing is the social meaning of technology. So that's a contextual variability in this case of the social meaning of technology is very crucial. So what we see is that engagement with technology intertwines with the fabric of everyday life, which often, you could say, diverge in unexpected way due to different informational and technological ecosystem within community, within organization, culture, and society. So that's why I think, like you could say, internet or social media platform like Facebook holds diverse significance globally And this reflects the societal and also temporal variation in this case. So this complexity and diversity in social meanings guides, provoke, maybe bias, control, constrain, you could say, the social behavior for specific purpose. So this emphasizes, you could say, the importance of understanding technology, not just as tools, but as embedded in everyday life practices and interpretation in this case. So that is the first thing when we think about the technology. And next thing, I think is also relevant to connect this, to explore the connection between the technology and the repertoire of contention for activism and resistance. So here, that's the second point about repertoire of contention. So again, I would like to highlight this relevance or importance of everyday needs to repertoire of contention. So the concept of repertoire of contention as defined by Charles Tilly, so that involves routines that are learned, shared, and acted out deliberately in this case. So research on repertoire of contention emphasize such kind of routines. They are deeply, you could say, rooted in everyday social life. As you can see, when Tilly described that, it talk about a limited set of routines that are shared, learn, share, acted out through a deliberative process of choice in this case. So again, you could say there is a close relationship between the everyday social life and activism and political contention. So for example, Tilly and Taugo's work on urban insurrection discovered, for example, the insurrection was associated with barricades. And barricades, where the building of barricades originate as a byproduct of everyday experience. So that's why it's very relevant. And the other key point, if you look at the quotation from C. Taro, which again is largely overlooked, is that the notion of a repertoire extends beyond this mere usage. So it's not just the usage of technology, but also including this kind of know-how or the knowledge in this case, which encompass the knowledge and skills involved in activism. So the emphasis here, you could say, is that to understand not only the actions undertaken during activism, but also these underlying knowledge and expectations. And that perspective also invites us to look beyond what people do with technology to consider the significance of everyday experience related to such kind of know-how and knowledge of activism and resistance in this case. So I think Crossley also talk about, I think when we want to understand the repertoire, we also try to look at the struggle and activities of everyday life in this case. So that's why I think try to summarize what I talk about that. So I would like to say understanding this dynamic of everyday life, everyday politics sheds light on two critical aspects, you could say, of activism and resistance. And these two aspects, they are, you could say, the analytical functions of the everyday politics as a benchmark. And first, you could say digital technology as a repertoire of contention do not emerge from a kind of vacuum in this case. But there is a limited discussion on this issue in existing literature. So which technology or application could be chosen as a repertoire of contention? And where do such kind of repertoire come from? So that is the key issue. So connecting the repertoire of contention to everyday needs will allow us to pinpoint the capacity of the agency in this case. That also exemplifies through various studies. For example, James Jasper talked about the act of selecting and applying tactics in this case. So a key determinant in activist selection and repertoire is their, quoting here, the habitus, everyday sense of, and grasp upon the world in this case. So that highlights the importance of everyday needs as a benchmark for exploring the origins and selection of repertoire in activism. And the second thing is the cultural meaning. So that is the cultural meaning of specific technology or application as a repertoire of contention. So here, I argue that merely, you could say, observing and studying the use of technology is insufficient for comprehensively understanding activism and resistance. And action and their interpretation or sense makings are two different things in this case. So the distinction between action and their interpretation is crucial for activism overall, because meanings do not inhere in action, but meanings they are attributed to actions through interpretation by individuals or various stakeholders in this case. Therefore, it's very essential to both theoretically and analytically differentiate contentious actions from their interpretation, which most scholarship, I argue, does not recognize, unfortunately. So essentially, we should ask, what do a specific technology as repertoire of contention signifies in a particular context? So the culture, meaning, interpretation, sense-making of digital technology. That's the key point in this case. So there goes this proposed idea of how we could explore the relevance of everyday needs or everyday politics to our understanding on activism and resistance. I just provide, you could say, a preliminary, a tentative answer to that. So I think turning everyday politics or everyday relevance of everyday needs into a benchmark and analytical concept means that everyday needs is an integrated or a rather essential part of activism and resistance, and should be considered as an essential subject of analysis in our discussion on activism. So what we can see here is the current scholarship on activism and resistance. That's the gray part of the circle. So that includes numerous studies focusing on specific technologies and the uses in activism. So what I propose in this case are two additional yet essential aspects that draw on everyday needs. So the first thing is that we explore these everyday needs to map out these available repertories of digital technologies. For example, we could do that through media ecologies and media repertoire approaches. So returning to my earlier point, you could say activists, they do not spontaneously adopt any available media or technology for activism. Having digital technologies anytime, any place does not imply that any technology is suitable for digital activism and resistance in specific contexts, as your answer also reflects in this case. So that's why we have to move beyond this taken for granted assumption. So we have to map digital technology in protesters' everyday life as a reference point for further interrogations of selection, use, and non-use in this case. So that's the first point. And next point is we have to incorporate the agency perspective. That requires focusing on the meaning, affordance. Also, I think in the human-computer interaction literature, HCI, they talk about interpretive flexibility of digital technology and its application. So these two concepts, the affordance and interpretive flexibility, actually acknowledge two issues for understanding digital activism. So the first thing is, you could say, relationality. And the other thing is heterogeneity in this case. So, for example, affordance in this case could be understood as the relationality among users, technologies, materialities, and contexts within you could say a heterogeneous social material nexus in this case. So relationality suggests the choice or non-choice and use or non-use. They are relational, which requires us to sensitize ourselves to contextual factors. And the other thing is this interpretive flexibility. So then indicates that each, you could say, technological artifacts holds different meanings and interpretations for various groups. So accordingly, we should avoid a kind of universal understanding of even the same technology, say Facebook in China, in US, in Denmark. So that's something we have to avoid in different activities and resistance across time, across communities, across culture and society. So these interpretations, they are not confined to moments of activism, but they are deeply rooted, shaped, observable through everyday needs in this case. So that's why I advocate for relational and contextual approach to digital activism and resistance in this case. So some methodological implication, you could say, okay, we have some theoretical argument here, then how should we do such kind of research? So I would say two things. First is scholarship on digital activism and resistance would be strengthened through more comparative perspective or comparative mindsets. So comparative in this case can be temporal, can be cultural, can be geographical, can be everyday versus moment of crisis. For example, and most of our scholarship, including some of my earlier work, devoted very much energy to one case that we never moved to a second one. So this is not to say, of course, we must conduct more comparative study of digital activism. But I would say in this case, you have to have the kind, as I say, mindset in this case. And adopting comparative mindset allows us to think comparatively, for example, why groups, individuals, organizations make different choices and to ask questions differently in this case. And the other thing to say is data and method triangulations through surveys, big data on people's daily use of media technology, and the ethnographical study of activism in everyday life. They are also very crucial in this case. So to conclude in this case, considering this everyday politics in discussion on digital activism, avoid this kind of consumption that using the internet or digital technology is a universal, is a taken for granted, is a self-evident, and going back to Karl Popper's argument, is a clocalized choice in activism. Instead, I would say this approach recognizes that technologies emerge from complex, contested setting or sets of values, beliefs, practical knowledges in everyday life, embedded in everyday life, which underpin how claims can be made and articulate for activism in this case. Yeah. Yeah, so that's what I would like to talk about.
Thank you.
Thank you.